Hello guys, welcome to one new edition of React Today, part of the World Health Project initiative. Today we are gonna remember the Canadian fallen in all the wars, First and Second World War. But of course the 11th of November, the 11th day, the 11th hour, the 11th month, as is remembered, we pay tribute to the fallen, everyone and every soldier that fought in the First World War, the lost generation. But what was the lost generation, and why is important for us to remember also how politics and how corporations benefited from wars, whether we like it or not. This is not what we're going to talk about today. Today is about Remembrance Day. So let's begin with the lost generation. Who were? And maybe today we are in the midst of a lost generation.
They made France the epicenter of literature. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, MacLeish, and others formed the Lost Generation. Their work influenced nearly every writer who followed. Their lives were among the most fascinating of the 20th century. During and after the First World War, some of America's best and brightest young artists made their way to Paris. They drank to excess, carried on illicit affairs, and occasionally found the discipline to write or paint. Tonight's biography is the story of this band of American intellectuals who spent the Jazz Age in the cafes and bistros of Paris. Gertrude Stein summed up her own situation this way: America is my country. Paris is my hometown. The same was true for the other poets, writers, and artists that became known as the Lost Generation. If you are lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, Ernest Hemingway wrote before he died, then wherever you go, for the rest of your life, it stays with you. For Paris is a movable feast. In the aftermath of World War I, Hemingway and other disillusioned young artists and writers flocked to Paris in search of artistic freedom. Immemorial place of inspiration, Paris in the 1920s was a city unsurpassed in its convergence of creative energy. Expatriate poets and novelists like Ezra Pound and James Joyce worked to reinvent literary form. F. Scott Fitzgerald created a voice for the new Jazz Age, while Ernest Hemingway pioneered a singular style of prose. Art devotee and literary godmother Gertrude Stein called this generation of renegade painters and writers lost. Ruthless, innovative, radically challenging Victorian convention, this lost generation would eventually produce the greatest concentration of art and literature in the 20th century. On the eve of World War I, American students of literature immersed themselves in the work of European masters with the hope of discovering their own artistic voice. These young writers, like Malcolm Cowley at Harvard University, had found little guidance among their fellow countrymen. The only authors to admire were foreign ones, Cowley concluded. It seemed to us that America was beneath the level of great fiction. As Cowley yearned for an American experience worthy of fiction, from across the Atlantic there came the seduction of grand events on the epic scale of authors Zola and Tolstoy.
The Lost Generation was a group of writers primarily, artists generally, who were educated on the values and virtues of European culture, a culture that largely existed in books. At the time of the First World War, when most of them were just coming into their maturity, they suddenly felt as though it was upon them to go and save that culture.
I must serve, Archibald MacLeish wrote his father, else I am not your son. MacLeish left his wife and children, his studies at Harvard, and a promising career at law to join in the war effort.
Archie didn't really need to go anyplace, but he felt called, and he was going to serve his country against the horrid people on the other side. So he signed up for the Yale ambulance unit.
The ambulance divisions throughout France and Italy were like college extension courses for a generation of writers, Cowley wrote. It provided us with fairly good food, a congenial occupation, furloughs to Paris, and uniforms that admitted us to the best hotels. Volunteer John Dos Passos was a product of New England prep schools and Harvard intellectuals. Born in Chicago, Illinois, he spent much of his childhood in Brussels and on tours of Europe with his family. But he yearned to experience the world outside of his privileged life. Dos Passos found a kindred spirit crossing paths with Ernest Hemingway, a boisterous teenager who joined the Red Cross ambulance unit to escape his Midwestern upbringing. Ambulance service was their way to get into the action, Dos Passos wrote, before the whole thing goes belly up.
They went and volunteered in various ways, and in that fashion saw the worst of the First World War, saw a Europe that had been destroyed. The morass of Passchendaele, the trenches, people who were disfigured by chemical warfare, mustard gas, and watching people get slaughtered by machine guns, sending cavalry up against tanks.
At Verdun, John Dos Passos saw countless dead and wounded in a battle of little strategic importance. In combat, Lieutenant Archibald MacLeish reminded his men of President Woodrow Wilson's pledge to keep the world safe for democracy. MacLeish was prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. He was spared. His brother was not.
And they found his body in a farm in Belgium about 3 months after the war. And he was lying in full uniform, and there he was. And that destroyed Archie.
It was a generation that was lost in the carnage of World War I.
Those who went off to see the Europe of their treasured books were witness to its destruction. With the armistice on November 11th, 1918, the Sons of America returned as men. President Wilson intended to keep the promise for which they fought. He envisioned America among a league of nations, leading through innovation and industry the means for future peace. But America was content to keep its prosperity at home.
There was a tendency to pull back and to believe that America, the United States, was really the seat of all that was good and everything else had to be excluded. There was an isolationist reaction to the war. They didn't want to join the League of Nations.
The idealist in MacLeish was shocked by the Senate's refusal to join the League of Nations.
What came after the failure of the League of Nations and the return to banal, if you will, filled him with real rage. And I think it did Ernest, I know it did Dos, this sense that of betrayal, that this bloody, terrible war hadn't solved one damn thing.
In the 20s in the States, you had a culture that began to be repressive in various ways. You had the expansion of the Ku Klux Klan that starts its northward migration. You have an anti-labor movement that's really working to quash strikes. But you also have the beginnings of Prohibition. This is a time where the country is run by Warren Harding or Calvin Coolidge, where the business of America is business.
As the Roaring Twenties began, bootleg liquor in speakeasies was not the only way to get a cheap thrill. There was the stock market, one which allowed a country to bet its future on selling short and riding the boom. As the country raced to make its fortunes, entertainments were fine, but little time could be wasted on art.
It's a country that sings itself songs like, "Yes, we have no bananas," and gets very excited about people going and sitting on flagpoles. In the face of that, there's this group who become progressively more disenchanted.
Ernest Hemingway returned to America with tales of combat, of romance in Milan with a beautiful nurse. But after the stories were told, Hemingway found himself back in the stagnant reality of Oak Park, Illinois. The difference in worlds left him lost in a haze of aimlessness, and his parents kicked him out of the house until he could find his way.
They came back to America after the war very disillusioned, very confused, all wandered back to their various outbacks and found that nobody really understood what they had experienced. Nobody understood who they were.
At 17, we were disillusioned and weary. We had come to question almost everything we were taught at home and in school. Looking backward, I feel that our whole training was involuntarily directed toward destroying whatever roots we had in the soil, toward eradicating our local and regional peculiarities, toward making us homeless citizens of the world.
As former editor of the Harvard Law Review, Archibald MacLeish returned from the war to begin a profession at law. He had a family and a blossoming career, but little time to pursue his desire to write poetry. Walking home on a cold February night through the streets of Boston, Archibald MacLeish thought back to the dreams of his college days.
By the time he got home, it was very late, and Ada, I think, probably laid into him. They talked all night, and he said, "Look, I've got to do what I really feel called upon to do." Calling was very important to him, and what he was called upon to do, he felt, was to write poetry.
The next morning, MacLeish entered his law office with his decision.
He walked in, and there were all the senior partners of the law firm waiting, and Mr. Choate was just about to offer him a partnership. And he told him, "I'm sorry, sir, I can't accept. I'm leaving the firm." He had the wisdom not to say at that time, "I'm going to be a poet."
Supporting the family by poetry was a time-honored impossibility in America. But rumors from overseas reached MacLeish. In Paris, anything goes, and it was cheap.
His father, a very dour Scot, who had helped him in his undergraduate years, went ahead and helped him through the years in Paris.
The dollar is enormously strong. I mean, you could live on $100 a month easily in Paris in the 20s.
So they set off. 2 kids, a nanny, Ada and Archie, for Paris.
A generation who burned with the passion to create followed MacLeish. For the Ivy Leaguers, the chance to realize and live their dreams was too much of a temptation to resist.
They repacked their suitcases with civilian clothes and headed back to Paris for sojourns that lasted months and sometimes years, but they always intended to come back.
Regardless of our political beliefs, we need to understand politics. I know it's something that nobody wants to talk about, politics or religion in the table or in the context of Facebook or in the mainstream media, because in many cases you have to be politically correct. But it's no problem. We are in the midst of supporting a war against Russia, using Ukraine till the last man. As I told a friend of mine, I hope still a friend of mine, I'm pretty sure, just this morning on November 11, 2022, we have a little conversation, so I told her, I understand. I did serve in the military. I honor and respect the fallen. If we are to educate the younger generations on what the sacrifices of others means for freedom, we need to understand politics. So do them, that is the young generations. But it's okay. There is another war coming. Let us see how we will remember it and how we will justify it. Right now we're justifying war against Russia. Canada is participating against another war. But yeah, are we going to send our young fellow boys, unless they want to go and they volunteer? That's their decision. But wouldn't they be better informed, as you have seen before with the lost generation, what they saw and how they didn't saw any changes after the First World War? What will change after the Third World War? I guess we are about to see. In order to have victory against Russia. Russia has not attacked Canada, has not attacked the United States, but because of the powerful interests of the fossil fuel wars that have been ended, especially after the Second World War, we need to talk politics, especially when the Third World War is at the door, very close to us, the country and the world. But today we're not going to get into that. We are going to just remember the Canadians, men and women that fell in the First World War. You all remember Passchendaele, and you all remember one of the best poems that we remember here in Canada about the Flanders Fields. I'm very grateful for Canada for having received me almost 20 years ago. And as I served in the military too, I remember today the fallen in the First World War, the Second World War, and maybe the one that is coming pretty soon to us. So in Remembrance Day, just remember. Let's remember and let's not forget.
What is Remembrance Day? Remembrance Day is a day where we take some time out of our busy lives to reflect on those who went before us and paid the ultimate sacrifice. My name is Major Rick Cameron. I'm the Deputy Military Advisor here at Canada's Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York. Remembrance Day is a day of reflection. It was originally introduced just after the First World War. At that time it was called Armistice Day, in commemoration of the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918. Armistice Day signified the end of the First World War, and it was to take effect the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, which is why we celebrate it or commemorate it on 11th of November every year. And at 11 o'clock, it is signified by 2 minutes of silence, right as the clock strikes 11. The devastation on the Western Front was basically total annihilation by artillery fire. It decimated everything. Houses, trees, everything was gone. But shortly after the bombardments ceased, the poppy was the first symbol of growth, of rebirth. And it was very prevalent because the soil conditions in Flanders were such that the poppy flourished. So there would be vast fields of nothing but red poppies. The poppy was originally introduced by a poem that was written by a Canadian medic during the First World War by the name of Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. After a significant battle in Flanders, he penned the poem In Flanders Fields.
We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
The significance of the poppy was highlighted during that poem, and ever since it has been adopted as the flower of remembrance. In the US, you have Veterans Day, which is also commemorated on the 11th of November. You also have Memorial Day. So in the Commonwealth countries, those are kind of all combined into Remembrance Day. It's very highly regarded in the Canadian psyche. Personally, I see Remembrance Day as a period of reflection. I reflect on friends and colleagues who were lost in the Afghanistan war. I also reflect on previous generations of soldiers who went before me to help forge a path for my career. I think Remembrance Day is very important to commemorate and to continue commemorating in the future. The intent behind Remembrance Day is not to glorify war. It's to reflect upon those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. And each year, Canada and other Commonwealth countries use this time of remembrance. And the theme for Remembrance Day is Lest We Forget. We need to remember what happened in the past so we don't revert to those ways in the future.
Hope to see you next time in the next edition of React Today. As part of the World's World Project initiative, don't forget the 2 minutes of silence. Au revoir. Bye-bye. Hasta pronto. We remember you, Fallen.